Hi, Kirstin. It's a great pleasure to meet with you. You were the winner of the last BACP CPCAB Research Award for Laughter in Therapy, an exploration of how therapists experience client laughter, which I found quite intriguing reading. And I just wondered what brought you to looking at laughter as a research project.
Well, it was part of my MA, and so I kind of faced that moment of what do you do for your dissertation? And actually, I had written an essay about laughter as part of the course that I was doing a few years before, and I kind of thought, oh, should I go back to that and expand it? And actually, so it had interested me for a while, laughter, but it really came from noticing changes in my own laughter that I'd noticed. So actually, I've had a nervous laugh for quite some time at university. It was pointed out to me by a flatmate who told me it was annoying, and so then became something that had quite a bit of shame attached for me as well. And when I was doing my training, it came up that this nervous laughter was around a bit, and it was often very outside of my consciousness. And I think because it was linked to a lot of anxiety, and anxiety that I didn't really want to get in touch with. And I noticed during the course that that changed, that the nervous laugh wasn't around as much, and that I was laughing more fully more often. And I noticed that in my personal therapy as well. And that's kind of where the interest started for me. And yeah, and then when I started, it's a really under researched topic in therapy, and that's kind of for all kinds of reasons, I think. But yeah, it was just really kind of grabbed me from the personal side, but also generally professionally as well. Kind of working with clients and noticing when there was and wasn't laughter, and just trying to think about the different types, because it's such a full and complicated kind of process.
And that sounds really interesting, isn't it? That it sort of started off with my own process, sort of recognizing, perhaps even my own defense mechanism. And then somehow through doing the course, through perhaps personal therapy, it sort of the defense lessened, and I was able to be more organic, more free in a sense with my laughter in a more transparent way, or a more personal way in a sense.
Yeah, and just really noticing that was something that changed, but it was still a form of laughter. But the difference between that kind of nervous, anxiety, defensive, I'm not too sure about this, but I'm kind of going to try and make it okay.
Yeah.
Through to actually being able to be much more, congruent, genuine, in the moment with laughter.
So how did that move from looking at your own process to maybe looking at client process and therapist process in counselling?
I think because I kind of seen it through the process, through my own kind of personal therapy process, that it did kind of start to really intrigue me. And then, reading around, because a lot of what's really been written on laughter has been very case study based. So kind of reading about other therapists' experience of laughter, or kind of when it's referenced and when it isn't. And that then really intrigued me, and kind of brought me to kind of think, I'd really like to find out more about this from the perspective of other therapists too, and how do therapists manage laughter in the moment, in the room? Is it something that's really not allowed, or is it something that is allowed? Does it depend on the type of laughter? And that's really what led me into it.
So just sort of thinking about that, and this brings up all sorts of questions for me. It might depend on theoretical modality and so forth. So I'm wondering, what was your research method to explore this further?
So I used IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis, and I was particularly drawn to that because it's quite a structured approach, as well as being kind of qualitative, because this was an MA dissertation, so in that I could do kind of large scale quantitative work around, but also, you know, that qualitative thing about, you know, what's the actual experience. Let's kind of explore this a bit more. And for me, it was also the structure that was there within IPA2 was really important. Because I'm dyslexic, I find that having some added structure really, really helps kind of my process. And I'm quite fortunate in my dyslexia. It's mainly like the really positive sides of it, that it's kind of that creativity and that lateral thinking, but it can kind of get in the way of having ideas and translating them down. So when I've got a structure, I kind of find that quite holding and useful. And certainly using IPA, I found, yeah, the structure within that and kind of the way that you then structure the interviews and kind of draw the stuff out, it was very suited to how I work and how I like to work, as well as kind of, you know, working as a methodology for MA level research.
Okay. And so who was it that you were interviewing? Was it just therapists or therapists and clients?
So I was looking at it from the kind of therapist viewpoint. And so I interviewed 5 different therapists, and I was actually very fortunate to find 5 very highly qualified and experienced therapists, and kind of a mix of people who are doing and talking the interviews about long-term and short-term, a mixture of kind of long-term psychotherapy and more severe presentations, and also, yeah, short-term work kind of being referenced as well. And so it was, I had 5 different participants. 3 were male, 2 were female, 2 were psychodynamic in their orientation, 1 was integrative, and 2 were Adlerian. And actually, you know, the Adlerian modality has quite a lot about humour and encouragement. So I think it really appealed to, in terms of kind of participants who are interested in being part of research. And I think they were all supervisors. So that kind of level of experience, and several of them were trainers on kind of courses, counselling courses too. So I was, yeah, really privileged to have, you know, really good quality range of experience in the participants, and I was, yeah, very, very grateful for their time in being part of the study.
So if I can just clarify that in my own, so it sounds like the participants, the therapists, were predominantly psychodynamic in their approach, and I'm wondering, you know, what that was about. And I'm not hearing anything about person-centered or CBT, as you said, integrative. And I wonder if that might be a weakness, that it's applied only to more psychodynamic Adlerian therapy.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's, I mean, in a small study where you're kind of looking for 4 to 6 participants, you know, getting that full range is always going to be possible. And I think it is definitely an area where it would be great to see more work that's specific to modalities as well. However, I think a lot of it does really transcend. And I think that a lot of what I found in my research, like some of the language, particularly with the more psychodynamic participants, was framed in that way, but actually, certainly kind of Adlerian and integrative, you're kind of talking about, you know, the kind of language I think that a person-centered therapist would also really be able to access and appreciate. And yeah, and again, you know, because this is really universal stuff in terms of how does it feel in the room when the client laughs, yeah, I think that can be applied to any modality really. I think your modality might influence how you respond to that to a greater or lesser extent, but I think there's quite a lot that does generalize with it. But yes, I mean, I would love to see kind of more specific, and I'm integrative, so I kind of do have an overview of those different elements to some extent, though obviously not to the same as someone who's really specialist or kind of within a specific modality in that way.
But I think also what you're saying then, from what I was reading, that there's reading from your research, there's been very little work on this, and I guess a lot of this is starting somewhere, isn't it? And you know, I guess there's a lot more work that can be done on this in the future.
Yeah, and it's also kind of looking at who has already been writing about laughter. And I mean, it kind of starts back with Freud. So obviously you've got that kind of psychoanalytic kind of base to it. And Freud distinguished between wit and humour, with wit being that kind of laughing at, and humour being the kind of laughing with in his terms. But then a lot has been written by the Adlerians, who's kind of in that more encouragement kind of model. So in terms of kind of previous writing, I didn't find a lot written from a kind of person-centered perspective. The main book on laughter, it was by Judith K. Nelson, who writes about it as an attachment behaviour. So obviously that's kind of drawing from a kind of psychodynamic background for it. So again, there's a really limited amount kind of out there from other modalities in terms of, which is interesting as well. It's kind of like, why aren't those modalities kind of engaging? I mean, as I said, most modalities, I mean, whilst there is some stuff from a psychodynamic point of view, it's not huge. So yeah, I think it does raise some interesting things about, is it because it's just so much, oh yeah, that's just part of the background, we just do that anyway, that we don't stop and think about it in those modalities? Or is there something about, oh, that's not allowed in some way? It's kind of, I think there's some quite interesting stuff around that too, but I think it is mainly just, it's a very limited area of research.
And that sort of leads us on nicely, I guess, to what were your findings?
Wow. I mean, within the IPA model, I kind of, coming up with a definitive list of laughter types, wasn't ever going to happen, because it's such a broad thing. But there were some themes that did come out particularly strongly. I think there are probably areas, and I think this is a limitation, that were missed because of it, because you're kind of talking, and particularly with a semi-structured interview where you're just kind of quite open to what the participants are bringing, as opposed to kind of coming with something predefined. Part of the idea of the research was that there isn't a definitive list of laughter types out there, that this isn't something we've been able to categorize, and that's partly because it is this very implicit relational thing, but it is quite hard to kind of capture, I think, different laughter types. But there were kind of three main themes that kind of came out. So one was kind of the types of laughter around defensive laughter. And I have to say, when I talk about defensive laughter, or kind of defenses in general, when I talk to clients, I often kind of, rather than, because defensive has quite a lot of stuff with it, doesn't it? It's got quite a lot of negative connotations, and I kind of think of it as a way of self-protection. And I think, if I talk to clients about that, I kind of talk about a way of protecting themselves, as opposed to a defense, which kind of sets up something more adversarial, I think. But yeah, so there's kind of laughters that are kind of part of that defensive system, and kind of experienced in that way. And there were kind of some subsets in that. And then kind of the positive laughter, the kind of full laughter, and how that was experienced, the laughing with. And then the third theme was around how laughter is used, how therapists actually use laughter. So I can kind of talk about a little bit about each one of those, and what kind of came up in each section. So starting with the defensive laughter, there were kind of three types that really kind of came out, and one was like laughter as a way of avoiding. So that kind of, the laughter's kind of masking something. It's kind of going, I'm just going to laugh this off, don't get too close to it. But the therapist really experiencing that as a being pushed away, being kind of, you're not going here, kind of thing. And then the next type was kind of laughter that was kind of quite destructive, that was kind of the laughing at. And this was more common in kind of severe presentations. And one of the examples that I was getting, one of my participants had worked in a women's prison, so kind of some very severe presentations. And that was kind of, the being laughed at could involve aggression, could also involve seduction, anything that's kind of aimed at destroying the therapy, that's trying to get the therapist to laugh, when that's not going to be a useful thing for them, the client, or the therapy. So that is quite, and that was experienced the most difficult type of laughter by the therapist I interviewed, particularly the kind of aggressive, kind of pushing away, pushing onto someone else.
So sort of deflecting whatever it is they're trying to avoid or not work with.
Yeah, but actually almost trying to do something that was destructive, that was kind of, I know you're not meant to laugh, and I'm going to get you to try and laugh, kind of subtext.
Okay.
So quite a lot about control within the laughter, or I'm going to laugh at you, or I'm really going to push you away. Really kind of, one participant was describing a client who had a big booming, pushing out there kind of laugh. So it's kind of, it could vary as exactly what type, but the feeling was very much, oh, this is about trying to destroy something. It's not kind of a let's laugh together and have some fun, or oh, I'm just avoiding that a bit. It's a I'm going to get you kind of laughter. Really, really kind of. So just that kind of, and actually something that, you know, would be a repetition of laughter of an abuser. And so that the abuser laughed in that way, and they are now in that kind of perpetrator kind of role. So kind of very, very tough for the therapist to handle that type of laughter. And then the last type of defensive laughter that came up was the kind of the nervous laughter, which was kind of partly there from my own bias, because I did specifically ask about in terms of laughter type. And that was kind of, it was generally more benign, but also kind of really experienced as a communication of, the client letting the therapist know, actually, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure I'm okay. But what was really interesting with that type of laughter, and I kind of come on to that later on in the research, was actually that bit was kind of the bit that changed, you know, that kind of nervousness was there at the start. And, you know, some of the therapists would kind of say, actually, don't really need to do anything with that nervousness, because it will just go. It's just part of that first I'm not too sure phase. And it's just, but it's useful information. It's really useful information in the therapy to kind of be able to know and experience the client in that way.
And that's interesting that you've also said, how do I as the therapist work with these different defensive laughters? And I wonder if there's anything you could say about that.
Yeah, and with those kind of defensive laughters, it's really the not joining in and the not kind of getting drawn into. And that was particularly hard with the more aggressive type of laughter, in terms of what the therapists were kind of reporting. Different a bit with the nervous laughter. That was kind of just almost, you know, actually, I don't even need to address it because that's going to change. So, and actually, I find this in my own practice, that if someone's kind of coming and they're laughing along the first session, you know, you just don't need to engage with the laughter, but you can still just be alongside the person. I think there's that kind of that almost standard kind of counselling training thing of, oh, I notice you're laughing at something that's quite sad. And I think you can do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but also I don't think you necessarily need to do that. I think there's a danger in doing that if it's kind of, the client might feel a bit ashamed at that moment about having that kind of notice. But actually, I think, you know, if you just don't join in with the laughter, so you kind of notice it, and you might kind of give a response that's not kind of like, oh, I can't believe you're laughing. You know, it's not a punitive response, but just a very gentle, okay, I can see the laughter, but not going to kind of join in with it. And with the avoidant laughter, it is, you know, that can involve drawing attention to it, but actually there's something about that avoidant laughter of kind of going, okay, and just noticing that, and just noticing that that's because it's hard for the client, that they're bringing that avoidant laughter because this is stuff that they want to avoid, and that might be fair enough, you know, what the stuff that they want to avoid, but it is kind of a mask that is important to notice and see through, as opposed to kind of join in with and collude with. And something that really came out in these defensive laughters was the importance of supervision. Was that kind of, it might have felt okay, but there in the moment, but then afterwards, that kind of actually was that okay? Was that right? What's really going on here? And being able to kind of take that away and really reflect on that was something that came through. It was really important when you're working with those defensive kind of types of laughter.
And I guess that there's something about we don't want to necessarily draw attention to it too early in therapy, but there might come an appropriate time when we might say, I notice when we get to this point, you laugh and we move on to something else, and I wonder what's going on there. That sort of thing becomes more appropriate as the therapy and the relationship, I guess, develops.
Yes, completely. And that was very much what was kind of coming out and being said, that actually, and even that in the first session, the therapist, might join in with the kind of nervous, polite kind of starting off of laughter if that felt appropriate. And there was also quite a big distinction between if this is kind of someone who's presenting with a very severe presentation for long-term therapy, then at that point that's very different to someone who's kind of coming for some short-term counselling, who might be kind of functioning quite well, and kind of the difference in how you kind of that with that kind of the kind of counselling or the kind of short-term, this person's functioning fairly well, there's less of a kind of danger that you're going to tip into laughing like the abuser laughed, for example. So it is very much that in the moment, in the relationship kind of thing. It's not kind of a manualized approach in some ways.
And I suppose the important thing is not to be seen as a therapist really laughing at the client. And I don't know what that I can remember quite vividly a client of mine. It was some time into therapy. We've been working together for quite some time. And they said to me, I've got something I need to share with you. And they said, and then I said, okay, fine. And I said, I've got a foot fetish. And I could just feel my feet going under the chair. And we both looked at each other and we both had that nervous laugh. But actually, at that point, it actually opened the whole thing up in some way. And I guess I wonder whether that fits into what you're saying or not. It felt important. It felt therapeutically important in that moment. I think we were both recognizing something, but it allowed actually us to progress with what was being presented.
Yeah, and that kind of does lead into this next type of laughter, which is the kind of when it's okay, the laughing with as opposed to laughing at. And that distinction is so important. And this is why it's really important to be aware of that. Is this laughing at or laughing with? And we do culturally have some stuff about laughing at, that's self-depreciating. I'm going to laugh at myself. And actually there is something to really notice about that too, is when is it okay and when is it not okay. And it kind of just going a bit wider for a moment, there's Hannah Gadsby's very brilliant Nanette, which it's on Netflix. She's a stand-up comedian, but she does this amazing performance where it begins as a normal stand-up set and then she completely takes it apart and kind of talks about, actually that thing that she made into a joke was actually some quite serious abuse, and goes into the kind of trauma around it, and then kind of about, wanting to give up comedy because actually she's encouraging people to laugh at her as a minority. And it's very, very powerful how she kind of takes it apart and kind of deconstructs it. But there's something really important about, is this laughing with or laughing at, and kind of that distinction between the two, because culturally there can be a lot of laughing at that can kind of go on, as well as the difference with laughing with, because laughing with is very, very kind of powerful and very healing, and that came out very strongly. Is this kind of the positivity of laughing, when it's the right moment to have that kind of laugh was just very kind of transformational in some cases. So the kind of themes that I got from the laughing with the client in those moments of where it actually feels okay to laugh, was kind of a real embodied release, a real relief, that kind of, oh, it's okay. And potentially at that kind of moment of insight and recognition, that's kind of where actually this is okay, and we can laugh together with it. And just, I mean, I had several of the participants talk about, that we've been really slogging along, and then there was this moment, and we laughed, and it was just this amazing release, and then the work shifted.
Yeah.
So what you were describing about it, there's this moment, and it helped the work. So that kind of time when it's, the laughter is just the right thing. And one of the participants actually said, it felt like laughing was the only thing to do. It was just the right thing in that moment. And this wasn't necessarily something that was deliberately set up at all. It was just one of those kind of moments of meeting, if in that kind of the Boston Change Process Study Group, that kind of that relational moment and connection, and just how important that was, and just how it felt, and it embodied very differently to the defensive laughters, which were kind of like, oh, might feel under attack or feel quite uncomfortable. You really feel the incongruence. But actually, the laughing with were very congruent moments, very full, very releasing, and that embodied difference was quite huge.
And almost, I guess, what you're saying is that this is sometimes in those moments that just are not the words. Sometimes a laugh or a grunt or whatever is actually, that's all we can say to express that we both feel on the same page at the same time in that moment, and nothing else needs to be said.
Yeah, and really that nothing else matters. There's kind of it was quite an interesting study by Marcy et al. And they did some recorded sessions looking at laughter, and they recorded skin conductivity. And they noticed that when there were times when the client would laugh and the therapist wouldn't, but the therapist would still have a warm skin response. So that even though the therapist wasn't joining in the laughter, they were still responding warmly in a way. And when they both laughed together, the response went really high for both of them. That it was kind of a really warm, positive, connecting moment. So there's all these different ways that we can kind of measure this and try and understand it. But ultimately, it is very much the beyond words relational kind of moment that goes on.
But I'm just wondering if also what you're saying there is, if we don't respond in some ways, are we almost blocking communication? Are we almost shutting it down if actually the right thing to do is just to be in that moment and laugh together? But if we don't, if somehow we hold back even though we're feeling it, that might also be a barrier to the therapeutic alliance.
Yeah, there can be that kind of missed moment. And I think, actually, if you've got a good relationship with the client, then, missing that moment, won't necessarily be awful. I think if someone reacts quite punitively to laughter in that moment, then that could be quite damaging to the therapeutic relationship. But I think it's maybe a missed opportunity to build something closer, as opposed to with that kind of, real genuine laughter. But also, actually, I thought it's quite interesting just that you can give a warm response without necessarily vocalizing it. There are these big moments where, it is just the only thing to do in that moment. But, the kind of actually, some holding back, but in a warm way, as opposed to in a kind of, punitive or cold. A cold response to laughter is very misattuned. Whereas a warm response is more attuned, and a full response is a full response, and that will kind of bring that extra moment of connection. If that's the more that's allowed, the more connection there will be there in those moments. And these are moments. We're not kind of talking about full laughter or anything throughout entire sessions or anything else, but I think just being able to recognize that it is okay to have joyful moments in therapy, because joy is part of life, and to be able to express that through laughter in particular moments, that certainly from my research felt very appropriate.
And it's about, I guess, being authentic in that moment as well, and that feels really important.
Yeah, and really just knowing that moment feels right too. That is around that kind of that supervision, that judging where you are in the therapeutic relationship, judging where you are in the therapy and everything else, because there's a lot of detail that comes down to. And actually the third part, or kind of third theme that came up was around working with laughter. and how therapists work with laughter. And one of the big themes is kind of balancing the risks and kind of the checks, and and that being quite important, that actually, is this going to be a laughing at or a laughing with? Is this kind of like past abuse, or the client getting me to laugh at them because they feel they're worthless and they feel they should be laughed at, for example? Or is this a genuine moment that we're in together? And again, that's where the supervision kind of comes in, but also that kind of judgment of where are we, and it might be appropriate that there's a bit of humour in the building of the relationship, and it again, completely depending on the client and the therapist. I mean, I would like to say I think you can be a good therapist and do brilliant work without laughter coming in at all, potentially. I think it's not something that's kind of like, this is the marker of a good therapist, but I think it is very possible to use it and use it well. And I think there's something around humour, in terms of what type of humour, that's very important too. When I was doing some research, there was a book I came across by a Adlerian, written in the 70s, I think, and it included a list of jokes you could use in therapy.
Oh, right, okay.
These, I mean, like, to me, none of them landed. Yeah, hardly any of them would have landed. But there were misogynistic jokes in there. There was a rape joke in there, and you're just like, that is really, kind of, and it's kind of, and that. But even taking that away, the idea that there's this nice set line of jokes that you trot out, it really misses the spontaneity. Because I think the type of humour that was coming out with the participants was very much, it's spontaneous, it's in the moment, it's kind of co-created, all of those things. It's kind of about like laughing at the absurdity of something that's happened, kind of incongruity, exaggeration. Someone who's anxious about someone, you kind of take it to an extreme, and then that's funny as opposed to frightening. And it was that kind of humour. It was in the moment, kind of stuff, as opposed to kind of a set kind of line or kind of stand up. I mean, actually, it would go far too far the other way if the therapist was there trying to get laughs out of the client. That kind of becomes a bit for the therapist rather than the client, potentially. But in terms of using humour, it was very much the exaggerated, and also kind of tackling the inner critic as well. Being able to kind of, if you kind of really exaggerate that voice, for example, then it becomes absurd, and being able to laugh at the bully, for example, really takes away their power. So even if you're in a situation where you're quite powerless because this is your boss, for example, and it's for whatever reason you can't leave your job at the moment, or you feel you can't leave your job, then what can you do in those moments? And actually, being able to laugh with your colleagues, for example, that kind of can just take away the power a bit. But equally, bullies often use humour to laugh at as well. So any emotion, or it can be very healthy, and it can be used in a very unhealthy way as well. And I think that's why it's so important those kind of checks and balances are there a bit. That it's not kind of this here is the list of jokes that you use with your client. That there is something about that spontaneity. And being it kind of, as one of my participants said, actually therapy has to be, a lot of humour has to be checked very carefully, but laughter also has to be allowed. You have to check the laughter, but it's really important to allow it, and to be able to have those moments too, when they feel appropriate and when they feel useful. And that's kind of, I think, where experience comes in, as much as anything that you can kind of directly teach. But I think it can be quite liberating for trainees to know that actually, it might be okay. You don't have to kind of sit there kind of frowning away or whatever else, but you do have to be careful with it, and that use of supervision to check it out, I think, is so important. One of the other things that really came out is laughter as an indicator of change, that this difference that I'd experienced personally, was very much there in terms of what the participants in my research were saying, that they were kind of saying, actually, yes, those moments of full laughter are more likely to come later in the work. And this shift in psychodynamic terms, that shift from seeing the therapist as an object to seeing them as a person. And when you're kind of in that more real relationship towards the end of therapy, then that's the time when the laughter can kind of come much more and feel more okay. And again, completely depending on the client and the presentation.
And that there's a lot that came out there, and I think one of the things that felt really important was, almost the fear of getting it wrong, and especially for students who always just want to, I've got to get it right, I've got to get it right, I've got to get it right, and almost you want to sort of shout at them and go, there's no such thing as a perfect session. This is why we have deliberate practice and supervision. But there's also something about learning to be in that moment. And there's something, I guess, with experience of actually, the gut feeling almost is, this is okay at that moment in time. That there's a sense of when it's not and when it's not okay and when it is okay, which comes, I guess, through experience.
Yeah, and also if you do get it wrong, you can recover from it. Actually, rupture repair is very, very important in the therapeutic relationship. And, there's something about if, say, you've kind of said something as an exaggeration in a more humorous way and it really hasn't landed with the client, then you can just put in a recovery statement. You can just come back and say, oh, I can really see that's not where you are right now. That's really, that doesn't seem to have impacted in the way that I was intending there. What's going on for you right now? And you can own it. And again, that can be a very important experience for someone to have, that rupture and repair kind of thing. And you can do that gently with
that sort of, I haven't got that quite right in that moment in time. Let me see if I've understood it differently. I was interested, there was something else that you picked up on earlier, and I didn't pick up on it at the time, but you said there was a difference culturally or with diversity and laughter, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I mean, this would be kind of from my wider reading. It didn't come up as themes within my research, though it was referenced a little bit by participants, not enough for me to draw it into a theme. But yeah, there can, humour is very cultural, and how we use humour as a culture says quite a lot about us. The traditional British humour, sarcasm, for example, is actually pretty passive aggressive, but it is kind of very much part of the kind of a British identity. But yeah, and there is something about having some sensitivity around humour and kind of knowing that humour can be used in different ways. But I think even kind of looking at our cultural assumptions around humour and what is and isn't okay, and being able to kind of go, actually, is this kind of self-depreciation, useful or not? And people do use it as a way of kind of being more humble or showing vulnerability or making vulnerability more okay through humour. With couples, humour can be a way of addressing difficult things. If you do it in a lighter way, then you can kind of laugh about it together as opposed to going in for an argument, for example. So, but it can be experienced in very different ways, and certainly kind of in minority cultures, I think historically you can really see how, for example, camp humour was used kind of to be a bit of a we're not threatening type thing, and you can see that kind of, we can make fun of ourselves and therefore we're not a threat in quite a few different kind of minority cultures, and also the reverse, where you kind of have this thing of you can't take a joke, when someone says something that's very misogynistic or racist or homophobic or anything else kind of couched as humour, that it's like, you can't take a joke, you have to be able to laugh at yourself. And this idea that we have to be able to laugh at ourselves in some ways, again, can be healthy. It can be healthy to laugh at ourselves a bit, particularly our more critical sides. It can be useful to be able to laugh at some of that. But actually, if you're really laughing at your own identity and who you are, that's kind of something that will have an impact on people potentially.
And it diminishes your own identity in some way if you feel you need to do that. And I'm wondering if that perhaps one of the limitations of the research is it hasn't really looked at the different cultural and diversity as in something else to develop, because there's lots of work for you to do, isn't there? You've started something here.
Yeah, or hopefully other people might kind of, take this up and look at this, because I mean, again, in the literature, there was only very general references to kind of cultural differences around humour, and inevitably, particularly when we're kind of doing some research that is fairly reflexive, it's going to involve our own kind of culture and our own identity, and the wider culture that we're part of. So, there is no way I would generalise this across cultures, and actually I think it's very important to be mindful of how much we generalise something or not, and where that doesn't land, and what we're ignoring and the voices we're not listening to. But equally, there is something about what we can do is kind of speak from our own voice, and then try and acknowledge and hear others, and acknowledge that our voice isn't the only one in those kind of dialogues too.
And I guess it's trying to work with the client's frame of reference, isn't it, all the time?
Yeah, completely. And there are some people where humour of any sort is just not going to feel okay, and other people where actually they really need a bit of lightness kind of in, and actually some of my participants talked about actually kind of trying to almost testing that out a bit, in the first session, kind of seeing, is this someone who can see the lighter side of things? Can we use that in a positive therapeutic way or not? And so there can be something about, gauging that, and as part of developing the relationship, how much humour someone is or isn't using can kind of tell you, a really huge amount, and particularly about their internal world. So, laughter as an indicator was this other thing that really came up around, is this an indicator of the client's anxiety? If the client really isn't able to engage with humour at all, is that an indicator around depression, and feeling kind of down? And so, or actually if someone's able to fully laugh and is talking about having a great time, a great laugh with their friends, is that a really positive thing that you can use that's a good resource for them? So it can really give you an indicator. And also, if as you go through the work, then that laughter is able to come in, then that can tell you a lot. And my participants kind of talked about this as in terms of the ending as well. When you're at that point where you can be real with the client and you can laugh together, then actually that's a sign that the work's coming towards an ending or an end point. And laughter was particularly mentioned around endings too, that there was kind of laughter, and there was this very beautiful quote where it kind of says, laughter was a parting gift, this kind of, I'm going to be okay, and if I'm not, I know what to do about it now. That kind of just being able to have those moments at the end of therapy, where that's around, and so really seeing that kind of, that beautiful thing, that kind of laughter as a gift, that the client gives at the end of the work, where you can kind of see that process and that progress and where they are now, and that they're in that more secure place.
And that's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that before. It's an interesting thought, isn't it, that the more, I guess, relaxed and in touch with themselves the client is at the end of the therapy, maybe the more they're able to laugh and experience and show joy. And that is a marker, perhaps, that the work has been done for now. I'm just wondering if there were any other limitations that came up for you during the research, or more questions that have been opened up because of the research.
Yeah, and I think there is, I've kind of gone through a few different types of laughter there, but I think it is a really kind of complex thing. And there are, so laughter around recollection, for example, that's not something that kind of particularly came up, but I think is very real. Laughter and grief is a huge kind of topic and area that didn't kind of come up too much through this. So there's I think there are lots of other laughter types that weren't included within what I've done. I've kind of mentioned the kind of cultural side as well. I also think that there's something quite important going forward about laughter as this kind of relational gauge and as an indicator of change, and being able to kind of see some more research around that. Particularly in kind of, if you're talking in intersubjective terms, and this idea of like right brain to right brain communication, or kind of putting that in terms of attunement, and congruence. I think there's something that you can kind of put in the language of different modalities that works for all of them almost.
So a possibility of looking at the similarities between the modalities and how perhaps similar ways of working with laughter, is that what you're suggesting?
Potentially, or kind of, what are the differences in the modalities around laughter? Quite often it feels like when you take modalities, actually, there's something in terms of what's going on at a maybe surface level with them, but when you step back, actually, experienced therapists are all working or holding things in similar ways, particularly around kind of, shared humanity, which I think laughter very much is. So I think you can kind of put these different you can put the neuroscience framework around it, or the psychodynamic framework around it, or a person-centered framework around it, and actually, those things would all still be there, but in using different keywords or different terms. And I think, within a CBT wasn't an area that I touched on in my research, and obviously, humour-based things can be specific techniques and strategies that could potentially be used around, and in CBT. Talking about earlier, we were talking about the taking away the power of the bully. So I've kind of talked to clients about bad boss bingo. So you mentally think of all the rubbish things that your boss might do on a shift, and then you kind of tick them off. So it's almost it's about taking the power away from those kind of moments and those interactions. That those interactions may still happen, but you can hold them differently.
I quite like that bad boss bingos, or ticking them off. You've done that one, they've done that one, they've done that one today.
I've used it for bad in-laws as well. It's kind of that. Any situation they go into that they know these kind of patterns are kind of come up, but you can kind of see them coming almost. If you can make it as that's the thing they do, it also kind of helps depersonalize it a bit as well, which can be very very useful.
So have you got any further plans to do any further research in this area, or?
I would like to. I've been kind of focusing on my own CPD more recently, so I've just doing my EMDR accreditation at the moment. So that's kind of pulling my focus a little bit at the moment. But this is something that I haven't actually written this up for publication yet, which is something that I would like to do. I've presented it in a few different ways at events and CPD events, but it would be good for me to actually get this kind of properly published as a resource at some point. Potentially looking if I can get some time and other things around it would be interesting to do a doctorate in this. But equally, I would really love it if this research was kind of taken and used by other people as well. I actually did this original piece of research in 2015, and there have been some kind of studies that have kind of come out since. One was there was a doctoral dissertation by Elena Aurora, which was about laughter and joy in therapy, and it kind of covered a lot of similar topics around the kind of release and insight, and she took a grounded theory approach, so kind of have put together something around that, and there has been some more research around categorizing laughter in different ways as well, by Gupta et al. But it's still such an area that just needs, I think, so much more. And I think because it can give us some underlying understandings about the therapeutic process, about what's happening, because if this is changing throughout, if this can be an indicator in some way, but also an active process we're engaging with, I think that can tell us something really important about the relationship. And of course, the relationship really is the most important thing in therapy.
Absolutely. And I'm just wondering, you're talking about how, hopefully other people taking the research forward and doing some of this work. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the importance of research. I know students get a bit, research, panicky about that, certainly the ones that we're perhaps accrediting. I wonder if you could say something about the importance of research to therapy.
Well, I mean, I think one way that research can be really important is hearing different voices as well, which is why I think it's so important that students do it, because we have fantastic diversity around, students coming through and their different experiences. And, research can really be a way of having, your voice in something that you are interested in heard. And you can come back and pick it up at different points. So this is something that I did 5 years ago, and I kind of thought, actually, I'm going to dust that off. I've just seen this call out for the BACP, and here I am now. I'm having this lovely conversation with you and being able to kind of share it a bit more. And I think, find something that you're interested in as a student, and then use that and use your research as a way of communicating something about it, as a way of you deepening your understanding of it. And kind of finding some other voices about it too, because it's also important that we hear other people's kind of experiences and we use that and integrate that and bring it together. And so whilst research can just seem like this dry academic exercise, it's about, different voices being heard in different ways. And I think that is just so important for us, particularly at the moment and where we are culturally right now.
And I think also alongside that is actually, if you read something, you don't have to agree with it. It's opening a dialogue. It might be you read something and go, well, actually, that's not my experience at all. I really don't recognize that. So questioning things, it's about opening dialogue and ideas.
Yeah, and actually, I think a barrier, particularly now, to kind of research can be, those literature reviews. When you're having to go back, like when I was confronted by looking at those 1970s, jokes, you're kind of like going, oh my goodness, this is really, and you're reading stuff that's all kind of white male dominated and homophobic, and it can be tough reading actually, and actually, you can kind of, if you just kind of translate the pronouns a bit in your head sometimes, or just kind of try and pull what you can from it. But I think it can be quite confronting to read some of that earlier stuff. But equally, if you don't read it, if you don't engage with it, you can't challenge it. And I think there is something about kind of going, it's okay to read something to challenge it, but also find actually which bits are the common ground and which bits are the bits that I don't agree with. Because otherwise there's something about going, well, that person lived in a certain time, therefore we're going to just throw out everything to do with that era. And it's kind of like, well, there was a lot in there still. You just sometimes have to read between the lines and some of the stuff that's kind of quite confronting to get to it as well. And I think that's it's an important process to try and engage with and to kind of, and to just notice that's a challenge for you. And to kind of, work on that, and to work on that with your peers, and to work on that in your personal therapy, that's all. It's all part of this process. That's very important for your own development too. And it can bring up all the school stuff about deadlines and authority figures and everything else. And that's also just part of that process too. To be able to confront that and come out the other side of it can be a very powerful thing. However your research goes or whatever else happens to it.
And I guess really we're researching every time we read things, aren't we? In some ways, and just sort of, I get quite excited about it if I'm reading something. Oh, I'm really interested in that. I want to know more. So, yes, okay. So I guess we're coming towards the end of our time, and I wonder if there's anything that's left unsaid that needs to be said from your point of view.
I think I've kind of covered everything. I think it comes down to the relationship with laughter, and noticing it and responding compassionately to it, and it also being allowed to have those moments of joy, and that it is okay to use humour, just kind of considering it and making it a co-created thing. And it's also okay if you don't want to use humour. You can still have a very good therapy with there being no laughter from the therapist. It's good for people to know that there are these different ways of working, and yeah.
And I guess it's about doing what feels authentic to you at the end of the day. If you're not someone that particularly uses humour, it's no good trying to fake it. Thank you so much for your time, Kirstin. It's been a really interesting chat. And hopefully we might get to meet at some point at a research conference in the future. Thank you.
That would be wonderful. We're all looking forward to normal times again.